The spiritual journey of Earth's peoples began with the idea of a goddess, universally called the Great Mother. We know that thousands of years before the Bible was ever written, creation stories centered around a goddess. The reverence our ancestors once felt for the primal power of the female is reflected in those dimly lit times of the prehistoric ages, when the power to give and nurture was supreme. Only recently, for 6,000 years ago is recent in the age of humankind, has the earth and the female perspective been ignored. A growing number of people are looking to the past through women's spirituality to find new visions for the future. They remember the eternal rhythms. They draw strength from the creation of their own goddesses.
Did you carry it?
But these are the symbols of the nation.
We don't structure women's spirituality groups hierarchically. It's simply women in a neighborhood who might meet once a month with the full moon or the new moon to celebrate things that are happening in their lives or the lives of their children or their family, or to mark the passages of the sun, the moon, the earth, to celebrate the Earth's holy days, the solstices, the equinoxes. And it's our creativity, it's our expression of who we are and what we feel and how we relate to the Earth and to the people we love.
Today we build monuments to what we call progress, a progress that threatens all life. Millions are made by it, millions live by it. And the conqueror has replaced the nurturer as a symbol to be respected. The natural world we once revered, we now destroy. We've long forgotten the spirit of the earth goddess.
But we feel very much that the kind of connectedness women's spirituality and goddess spirituality teaches about the earth is missing in politics today. And the people who are guiding our countries see only nature as a resource for industrial growth. They don't see the sacredness and the interconnectedness and the simple fact that we live on a finite planet. So we're very much involved in the ecological, environmental causes. And it's not a frivolous matter anymore. In fact, my daughter said to me 2 weeks ago that she'd heard all the topsoil was being washed away in North America by the farming practices. And I gave this perhaps too statistical answer. I said, yes, that's very true, and so many tons per year are lost, and it's very serious. And she just grabbed my arm and said, well, do something. I mean, it was really the younger generation saying to the mothers and the fathers, do something. We're close to the end if this continues, and they see that. So women's spirituality is not at all a closed little taking care of ourselves. It's very much grounding ourselves and reaching out to help the current situation get better.
I've got to get something to eat or I'm going to drop.
Women have always gathered together. And tonight in San Francisco, historians, theologians, environmentalists, and political activists meet and talk about their revolution. The history and mythology of women, ignored and distorted through centuries of patriarchy, is being rediscovered.
May I hold her? Mm-hmm. And what is her name? That's beautiful. Nuliajuk.
2 snakes in her hand and the breasts and all, we would use for Yamayao local.
It might have come from Africa. The Cretan religion was very related to the...
That's true. They had a lot of contacts
going up
from
to Crete.
That's for sure.
She's everywhere.
Yeah, she
You
is.
know, she's everywhere.
I was going to say that it might be interesting to contrast the way the goddess religion is returning. Mm-hmm. not at all in a warrior-like way, but first of all through individual consciousness, as we're all bearing witness to, but also through some amazing historical discoveries. You know, the Gnostic Gospels were unearthed in 1948 with this very important tradition of goddess worship within Christianity in them. And maybe 90% of goddess relics, artifacts, and shrines have been unearthed since the war, even though the archaeology has been going on since the middle of the 19th century.
I was told that nobody knew anything about the ancient goddesses because there was no evidence left. And it kept developing and developing until I ended up with this enormous amount of information about ancient goddess worship. And there was an enormous amount of evidence of ancient texts and ancient statues, ancient temples, things that we had never been taught in school. I mean, you could get your doctorate in certain areas and still never learn about these subjects.
40,000 years ago, our ancestors of the Western world, the Cro-Magnon peoples, arrived in southern France and Spain. The image of brutal, domineering cavemen is false. They were hunters and gatherers, wandering in small, peaceful groups, formed around mothers, dependent upon one another for survival. Locked deep in the earth are the wondrous cave paintings they left behind. They could be reached only by crawling for hours along precipitous ledges and through narrow tunnels. Perhaps the perilous journey symbolized the dangers of the hunt. Perhaps it was a sacred place, nearest the heart of the earth goddess. Over thousands of years, countless generations returned to these caves to add their mark. In this cave in southwestern France, one of the oldest existing sculptures of a human form was found. Archaeologists date her creation to 35,000 BC. The Stone Age woman probably began bearing children at puberty. The sharing bond between mother and child was at the center of clan life. They roamed long distances learning the secrets of the earth, drawing nourishment and medicine from the plants, the trees, and the roots. Vulva-shaped openings in the earth have been found, colored with red ochre, a symbol of life's blood. For the female was often honored in prehistoric art. The miracle of birth and sustenance offered by her body, the bleeding that came and went with the changings of the moon. She was magical, like the goddess Earth. Tens of thousands of female figurines have been unearthed from the Stone Age. Images of the male were few in number and more specific in form.
And somehow, my experience as a woman giving birth to a child put me in touch with the women's movement. Up until then, I was a real medical student, intern, resident kind of person who felt quite different from other women because my path was quite different from most women's. But once I was in labor and delivery and was experiencing at the deepest ritual level and the deepest life level what it is to be a woman and how it hurt and how it was also participating in a miracle and how none of my training prepared me for this, and what I was doing at that moment was what every woman who had ever given birth to a child had been doing through all time. I felt linked horizontally and through time with every woman that ever was.
After following the source of food from place to place, around 10,000 BC, people began to cultivate. The agricultural revolution changed everything, especially the relationship we had to the earth. No longer did people just accept what nature provided. Now we sought to control the awesome forces of the natural world. The people have vanished, but from China to old Europe, they left us their strange standing stones. Their placement suggests they were used to track the moon. Satellite sites now reveal that they all stand on energy lines which crisscross the earth. Stones have always been seen as reservoirs of power, described by the ancients as the Great Round, the cosmic egg of the goddess. Symbol of healing and prophecy, the serpent was always associated with goddess religions. Those times when women still shared the center of civilization.
I would say a matrifocal culture is one in which the female has a place of honor and respect, and that doesn't mean domination. And the women and men in these cultures in old Europe were buried in almost equal ways. The women had a little more stuff, but nothing like the patriarchal chieftain system later, where one man owned women and other men and horses and objects. So it was really pretty much an egalitarian society. There was not a putting down of men in order to elevate women. There was just a natural reverence of the bountiful powers of Mother Earth and the bountiful powers of the female.
On a small island in the Mediterranean are the oldest known remains of a goddess-worshipping culture. They fished then as they fish today, the island peoples of Malta. The eyes of the goddess still guide them safely into the sheltering harbor. "7,000 years ago, the first raising of crops was done with hand tools, probably by women, for we know that women developed agriculture and the domestication of animals. Their clay houses have been washed away, but their temples remain. Long before the civilization of Egypt, these temples, curved and rounded, were carved out of the monumental stone in the shape of their female deity. The sick found comfort in the temples. It was the place of healing, the place of community. It was also the place of the oracle, where one could hear the voice of the priestess, an ancient healer who gave prediction and counsel. On these legs once stood a 15-foot megalithic goddess, the first known colossus of the ancient world, a remembrance of the full-bodied women of Malta.
We believe that the goddess we have found in every place is always representing this Mother Earth, Mother Nature. And again, when we come to find the male representative, the phallic symbol, we always find it outside the Holy of Holies. Inside the Holy of Holies, we either find the statue of the goddess of fertility or her representative, what we call the pubic triangle. In several places, we have found what we call the tree of life. It's mainly formed up in this way, the main stem and branches coming out forming spirals. The tree was the medium between Mother Earth and man. So it is taken that every branch which is coming out of the tree is representing a lifespan. So that shows that every lifespan is joined one to the other, which shows then continuity of life. It could be that prehistoric men believed in rebirth and they've left this design for us to understand them. I've been working here for about 16 years now, and I've been going to these temples, sitting in these temples, and think of the period, the prehistoric period. And I really found, and I felt it, that people at that time lived happily. They were living peacefully in the temples and around the temples.
When they were building this suburb in 1902, the modern Maltese found the workers of 3000 BC had been there before them. 3 stories deep was the hypogeum, a chamber of ritual and burial. It was hollowed out of solid rock with tools of bone and stone.
It is thought that women, pregnant women, used to come to this hypogeum to take part in ceremonies so that the spirits of the dead living inside the hypogeum would come into the fetus for the rebirth.
The people in Malta today embrace a new and very different religion. It revolves around a male god and his son Jesus. His mother, the Virgin Mary, is a central figure, but she is not the fertile earth mother of the ancient Maltese. Ancient texts record that the goddess known as Set was the oldest of the old, she from whom all becoming came forth. The ancient Hebrews called her Chokhmah, she who knows all. The Chinese called her Guan Yin. She was known by many names. Eye of Heaven, guardian of the justice and truth of the universe. She who gave the unalterable laws of life. She who insisted upon truth and kindness. It was she who designed the stylus so that words could be recorded. She who invented numbers so that sheaves could be measured.
On a spiritual side, one of the goddess patterns that I'm saying are part of innate deeper patterns in ourselves, through which meaning comes. One of mine was always Artemis, the goddess of the wilderness and goddess of the moon. And I think about how my spirituality, though rooted in Protestantism, found its greatest strength in the mountains, in the wilderness, looking at the stars, feeling one with nature.
It took me many years to get the goddess mentally, intellectually, but I feel like I've always been her creature. And it was just a matter of, well, actually reading The White Goddess by Robert Graves, that was the big click.
I went through the same routine that you went through, being very, very idealistic and being exposed to the Catholic Church and being a person who would read everything I could get my hands on. I read all this and really assimilated it into my little skull here and believed that I could be a saint.
Yes, me too.
And
right.
soon.
Right.
And soon. By going to confession. And then I realized that there was a woman behind this thing. You know, this woman that I was saying all these rosaries to. And so I read more about Mary. And I thought about her in terms of really being a mother.
As a Catholic who didn't discover Mary, because when I rejected it, I rejected everything because it all made me feel so phenomenally uncomfortable. I felt what you felt, more of being at odds with everything around me, because as yet there was no support system. I was really very young. I was only 13 or 14 years old, and I remember reading some Native American lore. And I shared this story with Merlin earlier, because she said, how did you get started? And painting on ice cream sticks, popsicle sticks, images that reminded me of what I had read about the corn goddess.
The more I listened to what they had to say about the great bearded white man in the sky, the more I realized he was nobody I could talk to. You couldn't say nothing to the dude. He didn't answer prayers, you know. He could go off on you at any minute, and you were supposed to be grateful no matter what he did, okay? You know, this is nobody who made any kind of sense to me in my naivete, so I put him down, and I hung with Mary, you know.
I have not that personal a sense of the goddess. I wasn't Catholic. I didn't relate to Mary. I mean, if you're raised as a Protestant, everything gets very abstract. But I have a sense of the goddess as life force, as affiliation, as that which links us all at a deep level to be one with each other and one with nature. And in that, we are all connected with Gaia or Mother Earth.
In every culture, links to earlier beliefs are revealed through customs, myths, and celebrations. The dance of life around the maypole is done all over the world. At the Great Basilica in Mexico City today, they honor the Virgin Mary. They still dance where once there was a temple to the goddess Tonantzin. They used to bring her rounded cakes of corn just before the rains were due. Although the surroundings are Christian, the ceremony goes back through the millennia to the pagan world. Prehistoric societies had no known contact with each other, but the centerpiece of many was the mound of the goddess. This is the goddess Coatlicue. She was known as the filth eater. She came to the dying and consumed their wrongdoings. Shamans and healers in Mexico are still mostly women, carrying on thousands of years of traditions.
Venid, venida, las bodas. Hemos perdido el rico
Consuela Garcia and her granddaughter have walked many miles today to bring food to the grave of her mother. For it is the Day of the Dead in Mexico, a day to remember the ancestors. This ritual of remembering the dead is celebrated at the onset of winter, when it is believed the spirits are very near. In every part of the world, the dying time of the year is marked. In the West, we call it Halloween. Consuela and her sister remember their mother through the long night's vigil.
It helps me a lot to remember that I am an ancestress of tomorrow, and that what I say and do today, 5,000 years from now, may be coded into the symbolism of what they believed then. If you think that way, no tiny act is meaningless, you know, and everything becomes very, very important.
It might be more important if we can manage to have an Earth 5,000 years from now. If we can do that.
Part of the knowledge that's been passed on is a knowledge of how to survive, how to survive whole, how to keep the spirit whole and the body whole, and our relationship between each other and to the earth whole. And you know, that is the tradition that we keep alive.
Deep in the English countryside is Silbury Hill, the largest prehistoric structure in the world. And it was not built by slaves. It was built by generations of people using deer antlers as picks. It took them 400 years. It has stood for 4,000. In recent centuries, treasure seekers were certain they would find the tomb of a warrior king and his hoards of gold. But they have found nothing, and so it conceals nothing. It is the earth goddess for all to see. O lady, your breast is your field. Inanna, your breast is your field. Your broad field pours out plants. Your broad field pours out grain. Water flows from on high for your servant. Bread flows from on high for your servant. Pour it out for me, Inanna. I will drink all you offer. In a 30-mile radius around Silbury Hill, monuments from England's prehistory cover the landscape. The great ceremonial circles of Avebury and Stonehenge, places where the goddess was supreme. Local villagers still cut back the grass on this chalk hill so that the great Celtic goddess Ryan may face the sky. Vestiges of the earth goddess still cover the world as symbols of a dead religion. But in Africa, the goddess is still worshipped. Afrakete, Yameya, Oyo, Mavulisa, Oshune. Dark reservoirs of strength and female power.
I consider myself very fortunate in that I inherited a tradition where the goddess was never in question, you know. But the other side of that is that we were called savage and uncivilized because the goddess was always intact.
You know, sexism and racism do go together. They are the two sides of the same thing, and they are connected with the disparaging of the spiritual, of that connection.
And the need for dominance.
Well, that's it. It's the whole concept of hierarchy and the whole concept of some people are better or some types of people are better. And any kind of oppression, whether it's sexist or racist or ethnic or economic or any kind of concept, that there is that kind of built-in hierarchy, I think is something that as we get deeper and deeper into feminist spirituality, we find ourselves trying to question and to break down.
One of the things that I think is really important to think about is that within our culture, we tend to think of God as being on one plane, humanity one step down, and nature, animate nature, and then below that, inanimate nature. And in studying the prehistoric societies in the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, I think we are in touch with cultures where they didn't make that separation. So that when we look at something like the Minoan snake goddess, which comes from 1600 BC, some scholars say it's the priestess, some say it's the powers of fertility or nature, and some say it's an image of the goddess. And I think that we're really dealing with a culture in which all three of those things could be said about her or it.
Many years ago, women of strong purpose passed this way. The women of Crete, like their predecessors in Malta, continued and refined longer than anyone else the Stone Age worship of nature and fertility. Archaeologists were dumbfounded by the amazing discoveries they unearthed on Crete. There were great feats of engineering. They had charted the stars. They had kept written records. Unlike other civilizations of its time, the city-states of Crete lived in cooperation and harmony. Their customs, laws, and wealth supported and enhanced the whole of life. In a culture where a high value was put on arts and creativity, no personal mark was ever found on a work of art. There is no evidence of male or female dominance. The Minoan women of Crete were visible in every sphere of activity. They were legendary herbalists, healers, and midwives. They were merchants, sea captains, farmers, chariot drivers, and they vaulted bowls with the men. Peaceful and creative, not even a token fortification has been found. Today's scientific theory that all living matter of the earth forms one interconnected life system echoes the religious beliefs of Minoan Crete. For our oneness with each other and all of nature lies at the heart of goddess worship. The small and humble sanctuaries on the hilltops, by the holy streams, in the sacred groves, and in the caves, are still used today. An individual will light a fire and leave a little gift. The religion on Crete revolved around the goddess Nature. The serpent was revered, and the honeybee, and the labrys, symbol of harvest and cleared forest, the life-giving tool of the agricultural age.
It's a very interesting process for each of us who have studied the artifacts from goddess cultures. That on the one hand you say, yes, this is the female, this is in myself as well. And yet there's such a distancing because we then step outside the library or our house and have the opposite messages coming at us of what woman is. And so it's a very gradual process of actually taking into our own being what the messages are, what the teachings were.
By 1500 BC, volcanoes, earthquakes, and armed invasions had buried the last great goddess culture. When Sir Arthur Evans uncovered the great temple of Knossos on Crete, the proper Victorian archaeologist could only define it as a male-dominated kingdom, with courts full of chattering women. It is this misconception that is still passed on today.
English, Deutsch, Español, Swahili, Esperanto.
In the end, Sir Arthur could never quite come to terms with the feminist spectacle he had unearthed. He still stands in his heavy British overcoat, trying to understand it all. From all over the ancient world, pilgrims traveled to the holy shrine at Delphi, passing through the gate over which was written, "Know thyself," one of the central teachings of goddess spirituality. The curious are still drawn to the ruins at Delphi. Once they came to hear the mystical words of the priestess, the Sibyl, rising from the magical fumes of the temple. All over the Western world, waves of conquerors descended on the peaceful goddess-worshipping cultures. And at Delphi, too, the gentle temple became a male-dominated hive of exploitation, with the gentle voice of the priestess buried under layers of hierarchy. The early rituals and dramas first performed in the theater at Delphi were forgotten. Women and slaves were now brought to see the new plays of Aeschylus, in which Apollo defines the woman as a mere nurse, tending the growth of the seed planted by its true parent, the male. In the final scene of the Orestes trilogy, the goddess Athena was made to agree. "No mother gave me birth," she says. "Therefore the father's claim and male supremacy in all things wins my whole heart's loyalty."
And I think the transition had a lot to do with the rise of warfare in the Middle East, which became a significant factor in some places around 3000 BC and was a strong factor in the Middle East by 2000 BC just about everywhere except in Crete, which is why the Minoan civilization is one where the goddess tradition survived intact the longest.
First of all, that transformation happened. It wasn't an instant thing. It happened over thousands of years. And that what it involved was the transformation of symbols and the transformation of all the areas in which people drew power, the transformation of the erotic, the rewriting of the myths.
History books call it the dawn of Western civilization, the golden age of Greece. For the man, it was the beginning. For the woman, it was the end. The Greeks announced that history would now begin and proceeded to obliterate or pervert the 25,000 years that had gone before. Athena was redefined. Once the goddess of wisdom and love, she became the goddess of war. The violent and the erotic became linked as they never had before. Man, said man, had always been the natural master of the earth. He was now also the procreator. Athena sprang fully armed from the brow of Zeus. Eve was born from Adam's rib. Female inferiority forever was proclaimed by the book of Genesis. It is not to be imagined that women accepted the subordinate status peaceably. There were pockets of female resistance that gave rise to legends of Amazons. But the male soon asserted his total domination, and so it has been for 3,500 years.
So I think that what we've had ever since the rise of militarism is societies that you'd call them warrior cults. They're really celebrating war. They're antagonistic towards natural death, but they're creating massive death in warfare all the time.
And this is where we live today. Suddenly everything was fortified, the warrior was honored, we follow a sky god, and we have a patriarchal social system. I don't think you can understand patriarchy unless you look at the fact that fear is at the core. Fear that female sexuality will somehow become this chaotic force, that nature will become this chaotic force overtaking us. So we have to have everything very tightly controlled and hierarchically ordered. In every cultural era, there have been forces that were going toward the negative, toward the destructive, and forces that were going toward the positive, toward the wisdom path. And I think if we could get that message out to more young people, that there are cultural choices and economic choices. Yes, we can ravage everything as quickly as possible, which is certainly what we've been doing. Or we could try to move toward a steady state economics that's being energy efficient. It certainly does not mean shutting down everything. It means living more wisely on the earth. When we look at those statues that are half human, half bird, or half woman, half some other animal, our embeddedness in nature, our interconnectedness, as a species, we don't stand apart from nature.
There are many ways to pay homage to the wonders of creation, to discover the fullness of what it means to be human. There are things to be remembered. For 25,000 years, our ancestors found power in union and cooperation. If we listen to the echoes, they have much to say.